I decided to move to Tallinn in the dead of winter and got kind of a front row seat to seeing the evolution of the very well-run nation state when it came to digital governments.
What then was Estonia's approach for building out their e-governance program?
There's kind of, again, two tracks here. So one is the whole of society approach. So the Tiger Leap campaign, basically, it started in '97 and was focused on connecting all the schools to the internet, as well as a training component. And on the other side, you had the e-government development, and that was basically out of necessity, right? My favorite is the e-taxes. In Estonia, it basically has your documents pre-filled throughout the form. You scroll through, you click yes, you click accept, and then it's done. Even as a foreigner, it took me under 5 minutes. I think one thing Estonia has done really well repeatedly is, identify trends early in their development and then, kind of grow them out. And I just think that services like this are emblematic of this idea that government can and should, work for the people, and government can and should build things that are practical and useful and solve real problems for people.
Hello and welcome to the Charter Cities podcast. My name is Carl Peterson. I am the Senior Manager for Special Projects at the Charter Cities Institute. Today I'm joined by Joel Burke. Joel is the author of the forthcoming book, Rebooting a Nation, The Incredible Rise of E-Estonia. There we go. And so today, Joel is going to tell me about this great book that he's written. So first, I'm going to go ahead and start with Joel. Would you please introduce yourself for us?
Of course, and thanks so much for having me. So my background is a little bit varied. So I started my career in early stage tech and ended up working at the intersection of tech and government in a little bit of a roundabout fashion. So Estonia is a big part of that story. So I was in Berlin running a tech company for Rocket Internet, which is basically a venture builder / VC firm. And then I came across a job ad for a startup within the government, and I'd never heard of such a thing, and it sounded really intriguing. And it happened to be for the Estonian government. So I decided to move to Tallinn in the dead of winter and got kind of a front row seat to seeing the evolution of the nation state, or at least a very well run nation state when it came to digital governments. And I hadn't really thought about writing a book at that point. I just kind of found it interesting, and then I made my way back to the U.S. during COVID and ended up doing this program called Tech Congress, which takes tech people and puts them in Congress, and very aptly named. And I was advising members of Congress on tech policy. And frankly, I just became deeply concerned over the state of affairs on the U.S. side, and thought that it would be useful to dive deeper into Estonia's lessons and kind of draw out what was applicable and practical for the U.S. and for other Western democratic nations. And so that's kind of the genesis of the book and why I decided to write it.
Great. That's incredibly interesting. I think maybe for our listeners, it would be great if you could sort of give us some background on Estonia and how it went from maybe this sort of situation in 1989, to 1991, where you have this late Soviet, early post-Soviet country sort of wrestling with being a new nation, or a new nation again, and then ultimately how it sort of ended up emerging as this global leader in digital governance.
Yeah, absolutely. So Estonia, as you mentioned, achieved its re-independence in 91, and that's important to emphasize, and a point of pride for the country. They had achieved their independence in the early 1900s for a brief period, basically, in the interregnum between World War I and World War II, until they were once again occupied by the Soviets, then the Nazis, then the Soviets again for 5 decades. And so basically they regained their freedom in 91, and as you might imagine, after 5 decades of communist occupation and failed economic policies, not in a great position to succeed. And especially, you have to remember, Estonia is a relatively small country, both in physical landmass and in terms of population. It's got 1.3 million people. It's situated kind of just south of Finland. It shares a land border with Russia. And so it is in a pretty precarious neighborhood with a long history of occupations and no natural resources to speak of. So the country basically was looking for strategies where they could find a way to, frankly, kind of leapfrog or cross the chasm that had opened up in the in the country's development, especially when you can compare it to kind of neighbors. And so there's a long running collegial rivalry between Estonia and Finland in particular, which they share historical roots. The Finno-Ugric language is the same one that the Estonians speak, and so at the beginning of World War II, according to the research just before the war started, Estonia and Finland were at basically similar levels of GDP per capita and kind of quality of life. By the end, it was dramatically different. So Estonia was in this position where they just achieved re-independence. They are in a pretty economically, unenvious position, and they're way behind their neighbors, which they once were equal to. And so they basically were in a position where they were willing to invest in pretty bold reforms to cross this chasm and try and leapfrog the situation. And this meant, in some cases, eschewing, the traditional advice of Western, I shouldn't just say Western, but let's say, development bank style institutions. So for instance, Estonia was one of the first countries in the region to introduce their own currency. And this was the kroon. And this was against the advice of the development banks, financial institutions at the time, which didn't think they had the kind of state capacity to manage it. But of course they did. Now Estonia is integrated into the Eurozone. It's part of the EU and NATO, et cetera. But this was quite an achievement. And I think just an example of kind of the bold steps Estonia was willing to take and to buck the advice of, kind of traditional development pathways in order to, try and leapfrog.
Great. I mean, in terms of, Estonia's economic development, do you think that there were certain things the government did to help promote the creation of tech companies like Skype, Wise, and Bolt that ended up, having a pretty substantial, impact on the world, certainly in Europe, if not the entire world, because you have this very sort of narrow period of time where you go basically from having, like I said, the, Soviet occupation, where you said Soviet occupation, and then this emergence of tech companies. So was this things that the Estonian government did? Is this to some degree, a post-Soviet holdover of high quality Soviet programmers, or do you think that there's something else at play?
Yeah. So I guess there's a lot to unpack there. I kind of break it down into two distinct periods. So one is kind of the time before Skype and the time after Skype. So in the time before Skype, I think that the government was really focused on just creating a general welcoming economic atmosphere where business could thrive, right? So as you might imagine, after a few decades of occupation from communists, you become pretty allergic to communist ideals. So there was a radical embrace of basically anything that was the opposite of Soviet advice, the Estonians were willing to listen to. And so there was actually, I think it was Prime Minister Mart Laar who had talked about, he was one of the earliest prime ministers of Estonia, and I think he was 31 or 32 when he assumed the prime ministership. So, and he was considered old at the time. So it was a very kind of young and ambitious country. And he mentioned, he had heard about Thomas Friedman during the Soviet days, and he said something along the lines of, I knew the Soviets hated him as an economist, which must have meant that he was onto something, right? So basically there was kind of this embrace of free market ideology. And so I think in this kind of before Skype period, the Prime Minister Laar especially put the country through economic shock therapy, embracing free market reform. So that meant removing subsidies, privatizing formerly state-owned industries that were just not efficient and weren't going to be without significant changes. There was some agricultural reform, although there was basically more of undoing collectivization. Estonia during its earlier independence had undergone some agricultural reform already, so they were in a little bit of a better position on that front. And then implementing things like the flat tax. And so that basically made Estonia kind of a darling for foreign direct investment in general. One other thing I would mention here that I think Estonia did particularly well is that when they were privatizing formerly state-owned businesses and factories and such, instead of handing over the keys to the factory manager, which I mean, it sounds logical, right? Who better to run a factory than the guy who was running the factory before? But you have to remember during the Soviet days, running a factory was not about business. It was a political affair. And so the former factory managers were political commissars, or whatever the correct, or apparatchiks, whatever the correct nomenclature is. And so instead, Estonia focused on trying to find foreign partners who would come in and invest in either digitalizing the businesses or kind of making them more efficient. So kind of phase one, or the pre-Skype era, was really about setting up the economic and what we talked about, economics, but also rule of law, eliminating corruption, et cetera, to create an environment where businesses flourish. And then kind of in this environment, Skype happens, right? And so Skype doesn't really, I wouldn't say there were like direct concrete activities that like really were made to benefit Skype. But what happened was that after Skype became successful, the government kind of woke up and was like, oh wow, this is a huge opportunity for us. I mean, there was already some inklings of investment, like there was investment in e-government and connecting schools to the web, because the web was kind of seen as a place where Estonia would have more equal footing and could compete on a somewhat level playing field relative to like heavy industry, where of course the big dogs like Germany were always going to be much more competitive than Estonia, right? So it was, but I think in terms of specifically, stuff targeting the startup sector, really that came after Skype, and the recognition that this is an area where they can do well. And today they have programs like, Startup Estonia that, has legal documents focused on the industry. They have a bespoke visa to try and attract startup founders. They do a lot of kind of catering and changing, different laws to make the country more startup friendly. And they have, a fund of funds for venture capital to kind of help seed the venture capital industry domestically. So now there's a lot of government kind of, I would say, pro-market intervention in a way. And in the early days, that was definitely not the case. It was more about setting up the enabling environment.
Great, cool. So I think that makes a lot of sense to me in terms of Estonia's approach at trying to develop their economy after dealing with communism, looking at taking advantage of opportunities for economic growth, or effectively, like you said earlier, they had no resources. Small country, relatively small population, not a lot of natural resources to rely on. So it turned to the digital makes a lot of sense in terms of that approach. Skype comes along, turns out to be a sort of a wake-up call to the Estonian government in terms of ultimate opportunity for developing out their economy more. So then what was Estonia's approach for building out their e-governance program?
Yeah, so there's kind of again two tracks here. So one is the whole of society approach. So this is, I think the Tiger Leap is the most emblematic campaign, but there are also some other ones like Look at World. And basically this was the idea of educating the populace so they would be ready to adopt and utilize this technology most effectively, and specifically educating people who are about to come into the workforce so that they would be able to so basically that eventually the workforce would be ready for kind of a more tech or digital age. And this didn't mean like literally teaching everyone to code, but at least like creating a level of tech literacy across the nation. So the Tiger Leap campaign, basically, it started in '97 and was focused on connecting all the schools to the internet, as well as a training component. You kind of had that on one side where it was training the population, and on the other side you had the e-government development, and that was basically in part it was out of necessity, right? So you have a situation where Estonia has a pretty large landmass and not that many people. There's a big bubble concentrated in the capital, Tallinn, but other than that, they're kind of spread out around the country. So you could imagine if you're trying to provide government services or banking services, it's pretty difficult to do so profitably or effectively at a relatively low cost if you're a relatively impoverished country, in a way that reaches everybody physically. I mean, having a bank branch in every town of 10 people, doesn't make sense. Ditto with having a government office. It's not an efficient way to run things. So, I think there was an element of digitalization being looked at from, first the commercial sector, and the banking industry was one of the first to adopt internet banking in the world. But then because they kind of pushed internet banking and adoption, this kind of gave government initiatives in digitalization a shot in the arm, and it created this flywheel effect where the government and private industry would invest in educating people, which meant that there were more people who would access services like online banking or using digital government services, which created this flywheel again where they could get more effective. And so eventually this kind of spun out. But there was also kind of I think one thing Estonia has done really well repeatedly is, identify trends early in their development and then, kind of grow them out. So something that they're doing well today, for example, is while they had the Tiger League campaign back in the day, which was about, kind of more traditional digital skills, they just the government just a few weeks ago announced a relationship or partnership with OpenAI to bring ChatGPT to every school around the country and to students, right? So I think it's about teaching students how to effectively leverage AI for their life and their work. And so I think there's long been a concept of focused on long-term investment and kind of identifying the trends and technologies of kind of I won't say the future, but like the near future, let's say, and then rushing to kind of capitalize on them.
That's very, very interesting. So then what do you think that the best thing that the Estonian government has done in terms of e-governance? But also, like, what do you think that they've done relatively poorly at?
Yeah. I mean, my favorite is the e-taxes. So in Estonia, basically, you take your digital identity card, you plug it into your computer, or for most people now, you just use your smartphone, and you log into the e-tax portal. And basically, instead of, I'll just go through the kind of the Estonian perspective. It basically has your documents pre-filled throughout the form. You scroll through, you click yes, you click accept, and then it's done, right? It took me, even as a foreigner, my stuff was like more complex than the average person. It took me under 5 minutes. Compare that to the traditional American version where I pay a private company to plug in my own data that the government already has in most cases to then send to the government again for them to verify it. So I'm basically doing work. Usually I think it took me a couple hours, or if not most of the day on one Saturday when I was doing my taxes, plus paying a private company to give the government information that it already had on me, right? So like just imagine the hundreds of thousands of person hours saved on the individual side, the amount of money saved from not having an expensive legal industry or in kind of accounting software industry, and just the amount of efficiencies that can be gained, as well as the benefit of like it's somewhat more intangible, but just this idea of government building services that people actually, I won't say like using, but are good and useful and practical, I think creates trust in government at a time when trust in our institutions are at an all-time low. And I just think that services like this are emblematic of this idea that government can and should work for the people, and government can and should build things that are actually practical and useful and solve real problems for people. And then, sorry, you also asked me what was bad. So, what was bad? Okay, it's not exactly bad, but I will say so. Estonia started building many of these systems, and principally in the mid '90s is like when the bulk of the development, mid to late '90s was when the bulk of the development of most of these systems was underway. So as you can imagine, this is pre-smartphone, and so they were building for desktop. If you were thinking of like how people were interacting with government services and online services in general, it was through a home computer and that sort of interface. So something that the Estonian government has struggled with in recent-ish years is basically the switch to mobile, which I think they were a little slower to get to as compared to countries like Ukraine. So, for example, Ukraine has the DIA application, which is like the state within the smartphone, and basically it's in essence like trying to build out the same functionality as Estonia's e-state, but it was built kind of for a mobile first experience, right? So I think it's more of a kind of a user design problem and something of a legacy software problem. And so that's something that Estonia, because of the timing, didn't have to deal with initially. They started, unlike, America or, Germany or many other places, they kind of started with a clean slate in the early 90s and let's say legacy tech debt or legacy legal kludge, but now they do have some of that they have to deal with. And when it comes to the interface for mobile, they've been a little bit slow. Although that being said, like I'm here now, and it's definitely something everyone has recognized, and they've been working on it. So.
That's very interesting. And I think maybe that's a great segue into, my next question for you. Right. Like I have lots of discussions with entrepreneurs, especially in Africa, who are very interested in doing some sort of e-governance program. Right. A lot of them, especially focused on like e-residency, for access to whichever sort of, economic arena or zone that they are in. Do you think that it's possible to replicate Estonia's e-residency program in other jurisdictions? And is it desirable to do so? And I guess maybe even backing up, can you give our listeners maybe a high level overview of Estonia's e-residency program, why folks want to take advantage of it, the advantages to the program or disadvantages to the program, and then, maybe go into, is this a replicable approach for others to take with new special jurisdictions?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll put on my former head of business development hat for e-residency. So my job was basically promoting the program and its growth. So quick 101 on e-residency. It's basically the idea. I mean, it first started out as the idea of Estonia has all these government services digitized. Of course, these systems could scale up far past 1.3 million people if you wanted them to. So it was this idea of like what would happen if we just gave people from the rest of the world access to Estonia's e-government, with the idea they weren't sure exactly how it was going to be used. So basically the program launched, a bunch of people signed up for e-residency cards, also many not knowing what they were going to do for them, but they just, many people thought it was like a neat idea and thought it was interesting, and we're glad that the government was innovating in some way, or some government was innovating in some way. And so, but the main use case that kind of quickly emerged was to start and run a location independent business online. And part of that is due to the other factors we talked about at the beginning with Lars' economic shock therapy. So Estonia is like one of the lowest levels of corruption, relatively low taxation, high ease of doing business, because it's a relatively small country with a difficult language. Like there's not really an expectation that foreigners will learn Estonian, unless, I mean, maybe if you lived here for 5 years, like you should learn something. But if you're just doing business here, everyone speaks English, right? So it's relatively easy and low cost and stable for people to basically use Estonia as a hub. So in the same way that Delaware kind of emerged as the de facto place, or or I guess there's now a fight over this, right? But like historically, Delaware was kind of the de facto place where people incorporated in the United States. Estonia was kind of trying to build that out to be the Delaware of Europe. It doesn't sound as sexy and cool as like digital nation stuff, but like it's quite useful to be the place where everyone from the rest of the world, and indeed even inside the European Union, basically goes to incorporate their company and run it. And so today, there's kind of two groups of folks who really use the program. One is folks from outside the EU who want to use the program to kind of port in and get access to the EU single market, because you just need to establish in one place. And Estonia, again, for all the reasons that we talked about, is seen as an ideal place relative to like a Germany, where you have to hire an expensive lawyer and accountant, and your documents will be in paper in German, et cetera, right? And then the other side is actually a quite large cohort that I think I was surprised about, and many of us were surprised about at the time, which were people from high bureaucracy jurisdictions within the EU that were, quite often they're not physically there anymore. So, for instance, I was just I was in Estonia in part for a tech conference, and there were a couple of e-residents here, and one is a German guy I know, and he principally lives in Southeast Asia and spends most of his time kind of doing the digital nomad thing, but runs his company with e-residency. So he's not physically a tax resident in Germany anymore. So he, doesn't need to use a Germany company to manage his operations, right? So I think there's quite a few people like that who basically were like, well, I'm not physically tax resident in my country anymore. It's high bureaucracy, high friction, and all the reasons why you wouldn't want to run a company in Germany or Italy or France. So I'll just use kind of the Estonian model and framework to manage my company. Now, as far as other places, kind of building out this model and doing it, I think that this is pure, supposition on my side. My guess is that there will be a few regional leaders for big, like kind of regional blocks. So for instance, like for the EU, I would be surprised if there's another, maybe the EU is big enough that there's a couple, players here, but I would guess there's kind of one big e-residency player. I'd be skeptical that like, if every other nation on kind of the eastern flank of the EU also launched an e-residency program, that they would be that competitive, that it would be that worthwhile. That being said, I do think, I'd be bullish on, somewhere in South America or Africa where there isn't kind of that established leader yet. So if I think about Asia, I think about Hong Kong and Singapore, right? And so these kind of de facto were the places. And so I think Hong Kong is more questionable now, but Singapore seems like the kind of the place where you do incorporation. So I'm not sure there's that much room for an e-residency program to compete in that region. But for Africa, my impression is many people still kind of use Delaware instead of incorporating, domestically or regionally. So I could certainly see, like, if Nigeria or Rwanda or somebody in the region was able to really, become a front runner here, becoming like a strong regional leader for sure.
Great. I think this kind of does broach, another topic that I think is very interesting. And you discuss this a little bit in your book. You discuss the notion of, countries as service. And in this, as part of this, you do cite the Sovereign Individual, which is, a book from the mid late 90s, was, very prescient in sort of seeing the growth of, digital economies, things like Estonia's, e-residency program, where you have a country providing, a broader service to individuals to take advantage of, legal protections, basically enabling this relatively easy access to a choice of location to incorporate, somewhat similar to the idea of, incorporating business in Delaware in the US, right? If I remember correctly, you don't directly, cite the network state as a topic of discussion, but, this has come up in recent years with Balaji Srinivasan's idea of the network state, the notion that you can have, groups of individuals who sort of meet and develop relationships online, who sort of over time coalesce into greater and greater sort of physical spaces, with the ultimate goal of, sort of being establishing their own sort of, state of some kind or another, in physical space or semi-physical space, right? And maybe you could start cite Neil Stephenson's Diamond Age as, the sort of fictional reification of this idea, right? So you have, the idea in fiction, you have the idea, set out in a book. But, you, Joel, who's worked on sort of the front lines of this sort of arena of, states offering digitized services, countries as service or governance as a service. Do you think there is sort of any practicality at this idea of the emergence of network states? Or is this really just, like, at least for the time being, something that is really gonna just be existing states providing increased services toward a increasing number of potential residents or customers?
Well, I'm now abundance pilled, so I'm obliged to say why not all of it, right? So so I do think Balaji has some super interesting ideas, and I was I've listened to a bunch of his lectures and read a bunch of his work, and think it's super fascinating. And so I guess I would unpack this a little bit with kind of two directions here. So on one side you have the network states and kind of groups of people coming together and maybe forming, basically stronger communities. Like, well, actually, I was going to use the example of Prospera. A Prospera, or I think there's the Praxis folks who are trying to do something along those lines, and kind of one bucket. But I think also one of the trends that, at least the way I read Sovereign Individual and how I've been thinking about things, especially the impact of AI, is just that smaller and smaller groups of people are going to be able to generate significantly more amounts of value. So, for instance, you had Skype, which was a relatively small amount of people in the beginning, generating a product used by millions and millions. In the book, I talk about the acquisition of WhatsApp, which was, I think it was like under 100 people for 19 billion in the end. I forget exactly, but we're talking about like tremendous amounts of like value per employee generated in like the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. And I think you kind of see that again and again. And I do think with AI that will supercharge it, where one or two highly motivated members of a founding team can maybe they can create a $1 billion company just with a couple of folks, right? And of course you'll still need a bunch of backend infrastructure and kind of the environment, but it might just be that like one or two highly autonomous and agentic people are able to do this kind of themselves using an army of AI agents. But what that means is that I think that governments will need to be in competition for these folks. This is something that Tavi Kotka, the former CIO of Estonia, had really kind of focused on and identified a long time ago. And I think it's still true today that like the world needs to be in competition for the best and brightest. This is to me a very fundamental American idea. Like we take the best and brightest from the world and we bring them to our shores and help them build an America and become Americans, right? And I think that more countries will have to do this if they want to stay competitive in this world. In terms of kind of the idea of network states more broadly, I think I have some broad concerns with the idea of whether most things that would serve as kind of the connective tissue for a community or for like a net new community are strong or salient enough for people to like pick up and move, because the optionality that most people have, especially like if we're talking about remote workers and digital nomads who are like software engineers, desk jobs, like they've got a lot of options, right? Like, and developing something that competes with Miami or Austin or LA or SF, developing something that competes with these places for people who have options is like quite a high bar to achieve, right? So I have a little bit of skepticism about this, and I think that people have identified, I think rightly, that like religion is one of the key things that is like a core, like a strong enough driver. I mean, you look at Utah, you look at like Israel, for instance. Yeah, I don't know if folks are like focused on inventing a new religion to try and get people to move to a network state. That seems like a pretty that's a pretty ambitious agenda, and I applaud them for folks who are trying. But I'm much more excited about kind of, I think and you correct me if I'm wrong here, what I think of more of the CCI charter city vision of like working in looking at where there's rapid urbanization and kind of building special economic zones on steroids to kind of bolster existing trends and like really fulfilling an immediate market need in places like like Nigeria, like Kenya, like much of sub-Saharan Africa, where there's kind of clear need for like stronger governance plus expedited development for industry and housing and things like this. So I conceptually find network states fascinating and like am really interested in that space. And like indeed in the recommended reading for the book, I do have Neil Stephenson's book there as well as Sovereign Individual. So you can tell like kind of where my head is at and where my reading list is at. But I do think there's a lot that needs to be proved out here.
Great. Yeah. I mean, if you spend like long enough period of time in this space, special jurisdictions generally or governance as a service generally, you kind of do run into this sort of same series of books, whether they're nonfiction or fiction. I mean, so it sounds like broadly, in terms of governance services, you are more optimistic about some kinds of private sector actors than others, and maybe you're more optimistic about public-private partnerships over entirely private actors, or would you prefer to clarify that without me putting words in your mouth?
Yeah, I think when it comes to kind of unbundling the country as a service, I do think that public-private partnerships are a really interesting thing. And I think historically, if I look at like the defense sector, for example, we've kind of always depended on public-private partnership. Like it's not U.S. government factories building our F-35s and our munitions. It's the private sector, pseudo private sector enterprises. And think like it's just the where on that spectrum in industry or field sits, it varies wildly, right? I mean, like, I guess the closest thing I can think of on the other side is like the VA system, which is, America's, I think, largest healthcare provider, which is, government run, right? Which is, a very different way of delivering services. And so I do think that we'll see, my expectation is that for the United States, we'd see much more of the kind of the public-private partnerships in developing this. just given historically and the climate for how these things are historically done. For Europe, I do think there's probably going to be more of a push for the state developing some of these services and kind of splitting them off or leading with them. So just to give you a concrete example, Estonia has this program, Accelerate Estonia, which is basically works with entrepreneurs and as well as like civil servant entrepreneurs to take their ideas and commercialize them isn't the right word, but like if there's currently like a legal tweak that needs to be made or some policy change in the government that needs to be made, they'll kind of work to accelerate ideas that could potentially have a major positive impact for Estonia's economy or national security. And one of those ideas, and unfortunately it got shelved a while back because of the unfortunate timing of COVID, but one of the ideas that they were pursuing is basically seeing if they could issue long-term health insurance to digital nomads and basically help that like integrate them into the Estonian medical sector and kind of make Estonia like partially a medical tourism destination where if you're from a third country or you're a digital nomad where you don't have a maybe you're you're running your own business or you want and you don't have a health scheme or you're spending 3 months in Bali, 3 months in South Africa, wherever, and like you're not really connected to a local health scheme that like for big issues you would want to have a central hub where you could go. And so there's definitely explorations of like, I mean, healthcare is one of those things that to me is like the most intriguing, but you can also see I mean maybe I'm reading too much into things, but like rhetorically the way America seems to be approaching defense is increasing like kind of country as a service approach where we say, hey, if you're not paying your dues, like why should we step in and defend you? I mean, I'm thinking about the context of NATO, for instance. Like it's not so wild to me to think that maybe we increasingly get kind of PMCs or military run PMCs where we say, hey, for a fee that our military isn't being utilized or our certain military assets aren't being utilized. Like maybe we start selling them or putting them to work in another way.
That's very interesting. And I think there is, for better, for worse, some degree of connection between, some governance as a service sort of options or situations as you might see with a public-private partnership, special economic zone, and also looking at, the provision of security, right? Like even if you think about it at a high level, the idea that, malls have like private security guards, right? Why don't they just rely on police? The public police, there's a lot of great questions here. For what it's worth, a lot of times, certain security guards are basically just off to be police officers who are making a check, in addition to their public salary. Maybe I'd like to switch gears here, though. In your book, in the second half, you have a discussion on what the Estonians have termed as a Web War One. And I think this is a very interesting sort of event here that, deals with the extent of issues around, governance and security that we've sort of been hinting at. So would you mind, sort of giving us maybe a brief rundown of the event? What was this Web War One? What happened? And, how is the Estonian government now dealing with the aftermath?
Yeah, absolutely. So Web War One basically refers to an incident where in 2007 where the Estonian government, so as you might imagine, after decades of occupation, the legacy of that occupation is not something that many people are super happy about or being reminded about. But there is still a large Russian minority population due to the policies of Russification during that period, where many native Estonians were deported to Siberia and many didn't come back, as well as many Russians from Russia proper for the rest of the Soviet Union were brought into Estonia to kind of try to Russify the place, right? And so basically what happened in this incident was there was a statue, I think, memorializing the actions of the Red Army during World War II, which of course is a point of pride for many folks from the Soviet days, right? I mean, kind of fighting off the Nazis. But as you can imagine, for native Estonians, it's also like, yes, they fought off the Nazis, but then they occupied their country quite brutally for decades after, right? So basically, the Estonians wanted to move the statue out of its central location to somewhere far away, and Russian media in Russia, which is, I mean, quite close physically, basically started making quite a big deal about this, trying to rile people up, and it turns into an incident of like a night of rioting and quite severe stuff. But what happened next is that basically the country came under a huge cyber attack from, well, that one of the benefits of cyber attacks is that it's quite difficult to fully attribute, but I think like most people can posit where it likely came from, and which took down a bunch of government services and as well as critical private sector infrastructure. Like the banking sector was affected for a little while. And that being said, it looked worse from the outside than it was from the inside. So part of the way Estonia fixed it is that they basically like shut off outside connection to the country to make sure that like interior services could still be operationalized. So like it looked from the outside, it looked like Estonia was like gone and like one of those blank spots on the map like North Korea, right? But from the inside, it was kind of still running. But what that basically led to was the Estonian government. I mean, it was at the time, I think it was the first technically large scale cyber attack on a sovereign nation, and it triggered a whole bunch of questions around like how would NATO respond to something like this in the future? Like how should countries think about digitalization in an era where a cyber attack could theoretically bring them back to the Stone Age, and like triggered a whole bunch of interesting questions that I'm happy to get into whichever ones are specifically most compelling. But in the immediate aftermath, NATO put the cyber center of excellence here because, well, the Estonians knew how to kind of respond here, and it's continued to be, Estonia has continued to be a leader in kind of cyber defense and cyber development. They hold Operation Lock Shields every year, which brings folks from NATO and around the world from allied countries to practice defending against cyber attacks. So it's kind of become a domain expertise for the country and part of their, well, actually part of their business environment now. I mean, there are quite a few cybersecurity companies in the country that export their services.
My question, if you are talking about like a special economic zone, a lot of times you're just talking about, physical infrastructure of some kind, plus, some kind of jurisdiction over it, right? Special jurisdiction over it, right? We've already kind of talked about maybe governance as a service, these things. But in terms of, Estonia's readiness for, cyber warfare and, lessons they've learned coming out of, this, large cyber attack, do you think the Estonians are concerned about the future of potential cyber attacks in terms of its effect on physical infrastructure, whether these are water purification systems or energy grids, things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly deep concerns about these things. I think the mentality is a little bit like, I mean, there's this joke like there's two types of people: those have been hacked and those who don't know they've been hacked, right? And so it's like every piece of infrastructure that's connected to the internet is vulnerable, and so indeed. Infrastructure that's not connected to the internet is vulnerable in some ways. That's what we've seen from general Russian perpetrated attacks across Europe in the wake of their invasion of Ukraine. And so certainly there's concern, but I think the mentality here is that like we just have to address the issue and kind of move through it. And so what that means is there's kind of broad policies for educating the society on cyber hygiene. So this is like understanding when you're encountering like phishing and social engineering and just basically things like change your password, right? And so there's broad kind of societal education. Something Estonia also does really well is they have cyber reserve corps in kind of their defense forces. So this means that you, instead of like the traditional weekend warrior thing that you might have in the US, like it's much more of like taking people from the cyber sector of the banking industry, which is generally like quite strong, and bringing them into the military and incorporating them into the command structure. So if and when there is a big cyber attack, they can immediately like kind of grab those people and integrate them really fast, rather than kind of scrambling when the situation arises. And just in general, I think when you have made your country a huge selling point of your country being a digital nation and being one of the leaders in cyber and e-government, I think there is naturally as part of that an investment commensurate to that brand and that investment in cybersecurity as well, where you don't want to, if you're going to invest in building a digital nation and building all these e-services, you don't want to create a scenario where someone can just, come and flick your house of cards over. You want to build a pretty resilient frame there. And so I think there has been that awareness and that investment.
That's great. And I mean, maybe sort of zooming out, what do you think the biggest lessons learned that other countries can take from Estonia's e-governance program are?
This is a little bit, kind of meta, but one is creating positive incentive structures that actually incentivize innovation. So here, part of this is just like broadly cultural, and I don't mean like Estonian culture. I mean like setting a culture of an organization and like something that anyone can do. So, for example, in Estonia, civil servants are, if they develop an innovative program, they are talked about in the press, and I don't want to like generally pretty positively, and they're kind of looked at as, it's something that is good for the country, good for their career. Now, of course, if they're doing crazy stuff, right, and just kind of going willy nilly, that's not rewarded, right? But like there's a sense in the civil society or civil service that like doing innovative things that are good for the country is a net positive for your career, and it has this incentive structure to do this, which just like totally changes the dynamics compared to the United States, where, for example, I mean, you can only imagine where if you're a procurement officer at the DoD, right, and like you decide that you're going to bet $500 million of your of the DoD's money on some new innovative drone startup that's, because they have technology that's worked really well in Ukraine, and the startup ends up going out of business. Like, you're getting hauled in front of Congress for investigations, right? Like your career is, whatever it was before, it's getting, sidetracked, if not blown up, right? And so the way that we handle innovation in the United States is just set up in a way that disincentivizes civil servants from trying to do these things by and large. The other thing I would just say is that this mentality of long-term thinking and investment from the top of kind of political leadership in society. So just as an example, there, one of the kind of the foundational technologies of Estonia's digital state is digital identity, right? So this is how you'll verify who you are on the internet, and kind of essentially like execute transactions, or kind of you log in and then execute, right? And what they did at the beginning is they made it mandatory, which was quite unpopular. There used to be a joke that the only thing the card was good for is scraping the snow off the windshield, because like in the beginning there were no e-services that you could actually use on it. Like, it was just getting started. But because they took the politically unpopular move of making it mandatory, it led to a scenario where if you're a local transport company or a local grocery chain or whatever, you now have 100% of the population who are using this card, and you have a platform you can build off of. So instead of building your own loyalty card, you can just build an application that sits on top of the digital identity card, right? Or you can for the transport. So public transport is free in Tallinn if you're a resident of Tallinn. So you can just kind of tap your card, and it registers that you're a resident, and you get free public transport, right? And so it incentivizes the creation of more e-services, and people actually utilizing the card, which then kind of further incentivizes, and it's that flywheel again that we talked about. But in the beginning, it was not politically popular to do that. And so actually the people who kind of insisted on this took a reputational hit, and it hurt them politically, but it was certainly the right thing to do for the country. So I guess that's a long way of saying that, like, I hope that top political leadership is willing to do things that are long-term good for the country, short-term, maybe not the most politically expedient.
Great. And I guess building off that question, then what do you think the biggest lessons are for maybe private sector people who are looking at maybe getting into the governance of this as a service space?
It's an interesting question. I would say really understand your customers and your users and the problems that you're trying to solve. So, well, as well as, and part of that is empathizing and understanding their incentive structure. So like, when I started my career, I was early at a tech company, but I helped them stand up a sales team. And as part of that, we would always think about like, how can we make, our internal champion look like a rock star, right? And so like what that actually meant for someone was, it could be different. It could just help make them look competent. It could help make them look like they're saving money or being innovative or whatever. But you had to understand what that person want, what their incentives were, and what the organization desired. And I think the same is true for any entrepreneur trying to be active in this space. Is like, if you're going to work with the government, and understand who your customer is. Is it the CIO's office? Is it the economic development office or some other team? Like, understand who your target audience is, who your customer is, what they care about, and like really use that to build the relationship off of as you think about the problem that you want to solve, and just understand the incentive structure. And I hope, like, as you think about these ideas, focus on things that have long-term positive externalities. There are some symbiotic relationships between the public and private sector, and many of them, but there are also some more predatory relationships, or ones that are I won't name names, but I think about the tax industry, for instance, is one where, like, I wonder about the pure economic value that some of these companies generate relative to whether the government could create its own free to use software.
So true. And I thank you. I think it's a really good answer. I think for my my last question, did hint to this a bit at the very beginning, but maybe going back to it, what ultimately inspired you to write Rebooting a Nation, and what do you hope that your readers or our listeners ultimately take away from it?
What really inspired me in the end is, well, I think it was less inspiration, more fear, candidly. I mean, I went back to the U.S. and I was advising members of Congress, and I was just shocked at the lack of understanding and of just basically digital skills and capacity that we had. And this was despite the years of effort from folks like Jen Palka, folks at USDS and 18F, and many pockets of government that were trying to fix this. But despite their heroic efforts, I think it's been quite slow and quite an uphill battle. And I just got really worried about the ability for America to compete in a increasingly digital and now AI driven age, where the legacy government infrastructure and decision making processes that we have were built for an industrial era that is quickly leaving us, right? And I frankly just wanted to draw out lessons from Estonia, which is a highly democratic, egalitarian country that's pretty advanced, and try and find what the practical and tangible lessons were that we could learn from Estonia, so that we could improve our country and make it more competitive for the future. So really that was kind of the driving force behind it. Now, of course, I hope more people just enjoy the story and learn about Estonia, and because I think it's a fascinating place and culture, and hopefully there are some fun stories in there. But really, my big hope from this is that, like, it'll influence domestic policy in a way to show that we can build better government services. We can do so in a way that is effective and produces products that people, I don't want to say necessarily want or dream of using, but like, we should increase our standards that we hold government to account for. I'm not saying we need to have an interface as clean as I don't know, Uber or Notion or something, but like, we should expect more of the government than websites from the 1990s. So I hope at the end of the day that this contributes to some level of change in government modernization, and trying to make the country a little bit more resilient in future thinking.
Awesome. Joel, thank you so much. So Joel Burke, Rebooting a Nation, The Incredible Rise of Estonia, E-Government and the Startup Revolution. A great book. I highly recommend it. Joel, thank you for coming on the podcast, and we will chat later offline. Everyone else, have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the Charter City podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. You can follow us on your favorite podcasting platform or subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this conversation, we'd appreciate you sharing it on social media. Thanks for listening, and we hope to see you again.